I know people have all sorts of wrestles with the church. They have different kinds of experiences. I experienced from the church just like a complete forgiveness, right? Like a remembering no more, right? And that welcoming back with open arms has just been a beautiful thing to me. I really had this idea for some reason that there would be something punitive in the process of my coming back, that they put me through a sort of penance, right? Because I had left. I thought that people in the church would be suspicious of me because, oh, that's that guy who left for a while. He was an apostate, you know.
There's that
And
traitor who left and now just wants to come back again
right.
for
And
us
I
to
just,
receive him with open arms.
right. And so instead, it was like Joseph Smith with W. Phelps. That example of forgiveness from Joseph Smith is also what I've experienced, right? And so when the bishop had said to me, if the church couldn't forgive, it couldn't be the Lord's church, right? Like, well, the church absolutely has forgiven me.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Maybe you could talk next about what caused your belief to flourish again. And from listening to you in other interviews, it began with you believing in God again, and then Christianity, and then after that, starting to believe again in the restoration. So maybe you could talk about that process, how you went from an atheist to starting to be open and believe in God and Christianity.
It probably began first with gratitude. I read a book by Bob Emmons, the premier psychologist who studies gratitude. And he studies where does gratitude come from, what are its effects, what is gratitude, right? Things like this. How do we cultivate gratitude? He wrote this beautiful book called Something Like Thanks, The Psychology of Gratitude. I read it while I was an ex-Mormon atheist. And I realized that gratitude is one of the most beautiful things about human beings. My mother was just an extraordinarily grateful human being who lived her life really based on the gratitude that she had to her ancestors, right? For everything they'd given to her. And she wanted to take what they'd given and improve on it and pass that on to future generations, right? And I started, as I was reading this book, I realized that gratitude wasn't just something that I wanted to do in my life or feel, it was something I wanted to be. I wanted to be a grateful person. So Bob Emmons, he lays out some things in that book and subsequent books. He lays out some things so clearly um, that we none of us created ourselves, right? None of us gave ourselves all the things that we have. Even the person who sees himself as the most self-made person or independent or whatever, every one of us benefits from, let's say someone prides themselves on how rational or scientific their worldview is. Did you do all the centuries of science that worldview is based on personally? Did you come up with the scientific method? Were you the one who wrote the textbooks or the created the YouTube videos, or were you the teacher who taught you science? Everything that we have, everything that any of us has in our lives has some roots in what other people have done, and not just a few people, but there is anything that you've been taught. There's a chain of people going back and back and back and back who taught that to each other, who learned incrementally and passed that on, or There's a famous essay about how nobody in the world knows how to make a pencil. No one individual makes a pencil. Right? Pencils are made with materials from all over the world through like a set of different processes that bring all these things together, right? Something very basic in our lives.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Just think about
We
pencils is
live,
a pretty simple thing.
yeah, right. We live in a world of a global market of billions of people, billions. There have been something like 100 billion human beings who've lived, and those people have contributed to your life. So you think about, you have every generation, ancestry charts are exponential, right? Every generation back, the number of slots on your ancestry chart doubles. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 great great grandparents, right? It goes up 32, 64, 128, right? 10 generations back, you've got over 1,000 slots on your ancestor tree. Well, that means that another 10 generations back, you've got 1,024 times 1,024. That's over 1 million. 30 generations back, you've got 1 billion slots on your ancestry tree. What that means is that if you go back, let's say a couple thousand years, everybody who wasn't totally geographically isolated from your ancestors, like maybe off in Australia or wherever, depending on where you're from, right? Every one of those people who lived at that time who has living descendants is your ancestor. Countless people have made your personal life possible. Take out any one of those people, you don't exist, right? And that's just, those are really literally just a few of the ways that our lives are dependent on other people. And so I started to realize, growing things from this guy, Bob Emmons, his observations, that to live in gratitude is to live in truth. That to live ungratefully is to live dishonestly, because it's to pretend that you made you, that you came up with all this, that all the things that you enjoy, that all the things that you've learned, that all the skills that you've developed are just you, and that's a pure fiction, right? And so ultimately, we're part of something much larger than ourselves. And then I started to catch this idea. It was transformative for me, you know? And one of the areas in my life where it started to kind of eat at me was, well, who do I thank for like existence itself, right? Who do I thank? And I started trying to conceptualize I still didn't believe in anything supernatural. And so I started to conceptualize, well, what if I think of like collective humankind as a whole, past and present, as almost like in the place of God, sort of like I can thank for every time that I have something to eat or enjoy anything, I can feel grateful to the mass of humankind who sort of brought this together for me. But it was kind of like there was this God-shaped hole in my experience where I wanted to give gratitude to some ultimate source, but was there one? You know? And so that kind of got me thinking more. And then I wanted my life to have an ultimate purpose, for my individual purposes to contribute to some larger purpose. And I was reading in an unlikely source. I was reading in Skeptic magazine. So if you're familiar with Michael Shermer is one of the big movers in the skeptic movement. So they're skeptical of like religion, anything supernatural or paranormal, or even like alternative health kinds of practices and so on. And so Skeptic magazine tries to like debunk all sorts of supernatural or paranormal or religious claims. And so I was reading in Skeptic magazine, and there was a book that was advertised in the magazine called Biocosm. And I was really interested in it. Because it was actually endorsed by Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic magazine. And he said, Biocosm presents a view for how the universe could have an ultimate purpose even in the absence of the supernatural. And I was like, this sounds like a book for me, right? Like I want to read this, you know? And so I went to the U of U library, I checked it out, I started reading. The first half of the book is really about the fine-tuning of the universe for the existence of life, which is a problem in physics, a problem in cosmology. And so basically the problem, and I was aware of the problem in a vague way before I read this book. Basically, the issue is if any of the fundamental constants of the universe, the fundamental laws of the universe were slightly different, let's say the gravitational constant was like 100 billionth part stronger, then in the early universe, when all the matter was close together, it would have collapsed pretty much all into black holes and there would be no life.
Right.
If it were much weaker, then that would have made the opposite difference where the matter would not have coalesced into galaxies. It would have just spread evenly out into space. And again, we wouldn't be here. There'd be no
galaxies,
stars,
no stars, no planets
yeah.
forming, which is quite a strong
Right.
theist argument for the existence of a god or some sort of intelligent mind behind the creation of the universe.
Right. So the thing is that it's this way, not just with the gravitational constant, but with all different laws of the universe or constants of the universe. If any of them were off just by the teensiest, ridiculously small part, we wouldn't be here, right? And so I thought that I had kind of explanations for that. When I read this book, first of all, I showed that the problem was almost infinitely bigger than I thought. The odds of us being here, he quoted Sir Martin Rees, one of the discoverers of black holes, estimating that the odds of the universe, the fundamental constants of the universe allowing for the existence of life were 1 in 10 to the 200th power if they were set by chance. Well, 1 in 10 to the 200th power is a preposterous number. If you start looking into what that means, the number of particles in the known universe is about 10 to the 80th power. So if you had to do a lottery where if you pick the exact right particle in the universe, there's another universe inside that. And then if you pick the exact right particle in that universe, it's still like a 1 in 1,000 trillion chance that you would, if you pick the right particle out of another 1,000 trillion particles, then you win the prize and life can exist or whatever. It's almost like saying we're not here, and yet here we are, right? And so
I remember once hearing an analogy in a debate, someone used almost comparing it to because that can always boggles people's mind who are very scientific. But he was like, imagine having a pool or a snooker table, and all the balls are just fired around at random, and they just all happen to come together to spell the word love, for example. And it's if you came in and saw that table, would you think they all just happened to form that word just out of sheer chance, even though it's highly improbable of all the different ways they could go? Or was there some intelligent mind who organized them together in that way? And it seems like what you're saying with the fine-tuning for the universe is it just seems highly, highly improbable that those constants would be at those levels for life to have formed. I know I've heard different theories of a multiverse theory to account for, or it had to be that way in order for our universe to form. But it's a hard one, I think, for atheists to really. How do you fully get past that or account for that?
And I thought I had explanations, multiverse explanations, other things. And then I read this book and he systematically demolishes the very explanations that I had.
Oh, okay.
he actually enlists some reasoning from Richard Dawkins, no less, to do it. And I just was so by the time I got to the second half of the book, I'm like, okay, there's this giant problem of fine-tuning, and I have zero explanation for it. And I knew that in the second half of the book, he was going to lay out an explanation. And so I was so primed for this. I'm like, I'm ready.
He's going to debunk this somehow.
Right.
He's building it up. He's going to tear it down.
Well, he wasn't going to tear it. Well, he wasn't going to tear it down. He was going to explain it, but he was going to explain it in a way that didn't point to God.
Right.
Okay. And so his explanation was, get ready for this, okay, that the universe, billions of years ago, was fine-tuned for the existence of life by our distant descendants out in the future. The past, the origin of the universe, was engineered by our distant descendants at the end of the universe.
They must have had a really cool time machine for that.
He thinks time is a closed loop. And so when the universe ends, it just like re-begins. And he says this gives meaning to our lives because the meaning of our lives is to figure out how to help our descendants be able to do this. Well, I thought, but don't we already, first of all, how does this provide a meaning? Because don't we already know that it happened because we're here? So we know they succeed. So I can just eat my nachos and watch TV or whatever. I don't need to help with this because I know what's going to happen, right? But also his idea that like time was a closed loop. I mean, as matters of basic logic, we have ideas like the fixity of the past, like the future doesn't determine the past, not literally, right? And so on. And his idea just made no sense to me. And I remember thinking, he thinks this is more likely than God, right? Like I hadn't believed in a God, but I hadn't thought that it was like as improbable as this seemed to be, you know? And so the guy had inadvertently set me up to start considering the possibility of God again. Right? And so I had gotten into this frame of mind as an ex-Mormon atheist of just like debunking. Now, I thought, my whole life I have been conditioned to believe in God and religion. And what I need to do now is just sort of systematically root that out by reading like atheist critiques of religion and God. And so I had actually gone from originally just seeking evidence wherever it pointed to actually inadvertently ending up just trying to focus on the set of arguments that reinforce what I already thought, my atheism.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly I realized, why am I doing that? Because that doesn't fit with me. That doesn't fit with what I want. I want truth. I don't just want to reinforce my own thinking, And so I started becoming open again to looking at all the different possibilities. And I started considering, eventually at least questions of like, well, why is there something instead of nothing? What's the nature of ultimate reality? What would explain everything? I had questions in mind, even as an atheist, about the nature of consciousness, the nature of moral truth, because I did believe in moral truth, but it didn't seem to make sense to believe in moral truth. I still did. But where is moral truth grounded? Where does it exist? It's just in our brains? It's just subjective, but I didn't believe that. I thought there was actual right and wrong, And so in some ways, I had believed in transcendent things like moral truth, but I hadn't believed in any sort of transcendent realm or mind where those transcendent things could exist. So there was actually a contradiction in my own worldview as an atheist, right?
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And so now I was starting to confront the contradiction. It looks like there's a mind behind the universe. My own experience had already pointed to that, but now I was taking it more seriously. And so I became a kind of deist. I thought there's some sort of mind behind the universe. There's some vast intelligence. There's something that all this is grounded in. And then I started taking off the shelf individual experiences that I'd had. So you asked about, were there experiences that still had made me wonder when I was an atheist? One in particular. Right. So back, my family moved to Salt Lake between my junior and senior year in high school. That allowed me to start going to the church archives regularly during the summer. And then after school, I would take the bus from East High to downtown. I'd go to the church office building where the church history department was then. I'd do research until they closed up. I would walk over to a bus stop on State Street. There was a crosswalk there in front of on the east side of the mall, which is, there's another mall there, but there had been a mall there then. The crosswalk's no longer there. There's a divider in the road and so on, but there was a crosswalk then. And I had crossed that crosswalk probably a couple hundred times going to and from the church archives over the, several months before this experience. And one day I'd left the church archives, I'd gone to that crosswalk to go over to the bus stop. I knew the drill. By this time, I'd become more of a city kid now. I knew there's no light at this crosswalk. You just walk out. The drivers are going to see you. They're going to stop. They're not going to run you over. At first, I'd been uncomfortable with this, but now I'd done this, like I said, a couple hundred times. So that day, I went to step off the curb, and I had like a voice in my mind, a thought, said, "Don't go out in front of that car." So just a car had just rounded through the intersection, headed west on South Temple onto State Street, and was headed toward this crosswalk. I walked out into the street still. I just didn't walk into its lane. I didn't walk out in front of that car like the voice in my mind said. I kind of didn't make much of it. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not supposed to walk out in front of that car. So I stopped in the street before its lane. The car didn't stop. There was a kid in the street at the crosswalk, in the crosswalk, and the car just kept going. And as the car passed in front of me, I saw through the passenger window, front passenger window, right? There was the driver and there was a front seat passenger, and they were both like bent down, right? Like doing something down on the
Probably
floor.
reaching to grab something.
Well, I think my guess has always been it's something like as they had rounded through that intersection, somebody's big gulp or something had spilled and they were trying to like clean it up or something. Neither of them was looking at the road. Just after he would have hit me, the driver popped his head up over the steering wheel and then looked back down. So I walked the rest of the way across the street in kind of a daze, thinking, I just almost died. That car, this is a big boat of a car that they don't make anymore for gas mileage reasons. This has been like an old Buick or something, like 5,000 pounds. That's 140 pounds. They weren't slowing down. That thing would have crushed me.
Yeah.
And so that really for years had been one of my reasons for believing that God was there, that God was involved in my life. As I had headed toward atheism, I had questions like, well, it was like problem of evil and suffering stuff. It was like, well, God allowed the Holocaust to happen. Like, all those people died. Why would God have saved me? That didn't make sense. I didn't want to believe that God would have spared my life when so many people's lives are not spared.
Right.
And so I tried to come up with other explanations. I thought, well, maybe in my peripheral vision, I saw something funny with that car. And so that's why I stopped and so on. So once I had come to believe that that there was a mind behind the universe, it so happened that I was living in Salt Lake again. I recently moved back to Salt Lake. And I was doing work out of the family history library, research work. And I was walking past that intersection every day. So I started on my way to work, stopping and going to where that crosswalk was and looking, okay, if I look straight ahead, like I would have at this crosswalk, what can I see in my peripheral vision here? And I started trying to experiment, kind of walk through what had happened. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, my explanation of this makes no sense. Like, I had by this time recognized that if there's something funny that goes on, like when I'm driving, if there's something funny in my space of attention that I'm not fully conscious of, I'll feel funny about it. Like if there's I'll start to feel funny if a car is doing something funny, and my attention will be called to it. I'll look, and then I'll ask, oh my gosh, that guy's getting over or whatever, Nothing like that happened. My attention wasn't called to anything. I didn't feel uncomfortable. It's just a voice saying, don't go out in front of that car. I took it very literally. It's not like I felt uncomfortable going into the street. So it's kind of like if you and I were...
It almost like surprised you, the voice,
Yeah.
like you didn't sense anything was coming.
No. If you and I were about to cross the street and like or I was stepping out and you saw that a car was coming, you'd probably like say like stop, like don't go out in the street, right? This was like don't go out in front of that car, right? And so I went right out into the street, right? I just didn't go in front of it, which is the thing I needed to not do in order to survive, right? It's just not go in front of it, but it put me where I could look right in that window and see what was going on and realize, hey, my life's just been saved, right? And I thought about other things about this experience, and I thought, no, I didn't know what was going to happen. I couldn't have known. Something outside me knew and warned me about this. So then I started thinking, okay, God's actually there and God's involved in my life. God cares and is involved in my life. I was still a long ways from coming back to the church. I still was totally confident in my view that Joseph Smith was a sort of scoundrel, right? But I I did start maybe after I started believing in God, I started trying to develop a relationship with God, right? And I looked into different faiths, the Baha'i faith, really I thought was incredibly cool. I became really attached to that. Um, I I wasn't necessarily taking it entirely literally, but I loved sort of the vision of it. Um, I started a really good friend of mine, Maxine Hanks, was really like encouraging me in certain ways. She was out of the church at the time. She'd been excommunicated years earlier, and she'd gone through a kind of atheist phase, but she'd come to see she had like a really spiritual, mystical outlook on things. She'd come to see Joseph Smith the Sincere. I would periodically toy with the idea, well, could I go back to the LDS church? Like, could I make that work intellectually and like socially, like being part of this community and contributing to it? And so I would kind of once in a blue moon, every several months, I'd sort of play with this, like, well, what if this and what if that? And I would sort of be constructing this thing in my mind. And eventually I'd always get to some point where, no, I can't make that fit. And it was like the whole thing was a house of cards, it would all collapse. Right. Um, and I, but during that time, like something, one of the most tragic things in my life happened. So, I had a little brother. I don't know if you can see or
Yeah.
what you can't see. This is my little brother Charles. He was the youngest in our family.
Is that you
Um,
to the right?
that's me up there.
Oh, up
That's
there.
my brother there, yeah. So this is Charles, and Charles was wonderful. I know people tend to speak well of the dead, but everybody spoke well of Charles while he was alive, right? He just loved to help people. He loved to make people happy. He's a very bright spirit. Charles died at 25, and I saw him the night before he died, um, and had no idea, right, what was coming the next day. And it was like an inadvertent like combination of medicines that had interactions with each other, right? And he just stopped breathing, right?
Dear. So sorry.
And that really got me searching a lot. I believe vaguely at this point in some sort of afterlife, but like a resurrection, like would I see my brother again? Would I hear his voice again? Things like that. His viewing was just, dreadful, so sad. And I thought I would never see him again, right? And it got me searching into like I read N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. I really started studying the accounts of Christ's resurrection, the evidence on that. And I started thinking that there was some basis for believing in Christ's resurrection, that if you wanted to explain how did early Christianity come about, right? There had been lots of people in Judaism of that time and before and after who claimed to be the Messiah. And what would happen is every time the Messiah died or was killed, the supposed Messiah's movement would fizzle out, right? Because that disproves it. The Messiah is supposed to like make everything right again. If the Messiah dies and leaves the world as it is, like doesn't make everything right, then he wasn't the Messiah, is the Jewish view, right? Why was this guy different, right? Well, numerous people said they had seen him after he died, right? And also, N.T. Wright makes the argument that people at the time believed in like ghosts, sort of apparitions, post-mortal apparitions. If the tomb were not empty, if his body was still in the tomb, and they were just like encountering apparitions, they wouldn't have thought that he was resurrected. They would have thought he was a ghost. Okay. And people even thought they could have some sort of physical encounters with ghosts, right? So, on some level. And so, their belief that he was resurrected entails that the tomb had to be empty and they saw him. And so, for one who already believes that there's a God who intervenes in human life, then that creates the real possibility or plausibility that, hey, like, why was the tomb empty and why were they seeing him? And look at the power of his teachings. And maybe this is all legit. Right? And so I became, again, and in a different way, because now I was not a Latter-day Saint, a Christian. Right? I So like I gave my life to God. I prayed. Actually, it was in, like I said, I was doing research work at the Family History Library. I went into one of the little instruction rooms off to the side one evening by myself, and I knelt down and prayed. And I felt that God had reached out to me in Christ, to have a relationship with me. And on my way home that night, I think I was walking up South Temple past the Cathedral of the Madeleine, and I lived in the Avenues, and I felt just like wave after wave of peace settle over me. And it wasn't like, I like to say, this wasn't like a peace as in the absence of trouble. This was peace like a palpable presence. Like so thick you could cut it with a knife, like it was there, right? And I just felt God's love poured out on me. And I was Christian, right? I started reading the New Testament a lot devotionally, and I started just deeply wanting to be closer to Christ, have a deeper relationship with Christ. And I started remembering, like back in my mid-20s at BYU, when I would read the Book of Mormon a lot devotionally, like it could help me to feel closer to Christ. And I thought, well, I thought to myself, I know, quote unquote, right, that like Joseph Smith just came up with the Book of Mormon and that he was like a rascal, right? But I remember that the Book of Mormon has this power for me. And so maybe I'll supplement my devotional reading with reading the Book of Mormon. So I started doing that, and it seemed like, wow, this is really fruitful for me spiritually.
Like,
And
I
then
believe in Jesus again, and it speaks a lot about Jesus Christ. So even if it's a fictional text written by, maybe a false prophet, Jesus might not mind because it talks a lot about him. Might bring me closer to him.
It really seemed to point me to him. But then I got really confused about it all. I thought, what am I doing? Like, I think Jesus is really real, but I don't think this is real. And what's described in this book, why am I just got confused. I'm like, and I was starting graduate school right then. And I thought, maybe I'll just put this all on the shelf during the first semester, focus on graduate school, then try to figure this out after.
And how many years was this after you left the church? Was it around 3 or 4 years time you believed in, Jesus again and felt like
I was out of the church for 5 years.
5 years? Okay, so this is about 5 years on.
Yeah. It was almost exactly 5 years that I was out, just shy of 5 years. So I mean, at this point it was like 4 years, but like at the end of that first year in my master's program, I was doing a paper for a class that Philip Barlow taught on Joseph Smith biography and autobiography on the first vision. And mind you, I didn't think there was a first vision. I thought there was a first vision narrative that Joseph Smith told. That much was clear, right? So I started to think, well, maybe sort of a function of a narrative was to mark Joseph Smith as a seer, right? Or a prophet. Like it's his like calling as a prophet and a seer. I became aware of an account of the first vision from John Auger, saying that Joseph Smith had related the first vision to him and had pointed to his eyes and said that at the beginning of this experience, the Lord touched his eyes, and then he was able to see him. He was able to see the vision, right? And I thought, well, this is like Jesus healing the eyes of the blind by touching their eyes. It's like the idea is he's being healed from spiritual blindness. I started looking in Latter-day Saint scripture, like, oh, in the book of Abraham 3, I think it is, the Lord puts his hand on Abraham's eyes and Abraham can see all of God's creations. And I saw that there were other things in Latter-day Saint scripture, in the Bible and Latter-day Saint scripture that were like this. And I thought, okay, I was seeing a sort of functionalist view of the first vision narrative, thinking, oh, it's describing like his initiation as a seer, right?
And it's also a pretty cool account for that because I think it's a later account, and it's from John Alger, but there's a lot of questions about was it a vision or was it a visitation? And if you believe that account, it would almost support that the father and the son were really there if they touched Joseph on the eyes. Like that's pretty cool. That's a cool detail.
Yeah. So it is a cool detail. Well, as I was writing this paper for Philip Barlow's class, right at the end of the semester, I was sitting in the up at Utah State. I was sitting in the library cafe writing, and suddenly a host of different connections just came together. I was thinking about like, okay, the touching of one's eyes in order that one might see has ritual connections for Latter-day Saints that I had encountered that I hadn't thought of before. I started seeing how there was like a parallel story in the Book of Ether with the brother of Jared, where essentially the brother of Jared's people are going to be blind. They're going to be in the dark going across the ocean in their vessels, right? And so he asked the Lord to touch the stones, right, that they're going to put in the vessels to light them up so they can see. And the Lord asked the brother of Jared a question about this. What is it that you would that I should do for you? And I knew that someone else had written about how this question, the same question, appears in, it might be Matthew and Luke, I can't remember for sure, but in the Gospels, where Jesus is in Jericho and these blind men call after him, Jesus, thou son of David, and he asks them, what is it you would that I should do for you? And one of the men says, Lord, my eyes that I might see. And Jesus touches his eyes, and then the man can see. So the same question appears in these two narratives, and both narratives involve the touching of something in order that the people can see. Right? Now, in one case, it's the eyes themselves. In the other case, it's these stones. But after the Lord touches these stones, he gives the brother of Jared two other stones that he's touched with his finger, right? And they're the interpreters, right? They're these like spectacles he wears in front of his eyes, right? And oh wow, that's another instance. It's sort of a variant instance of the same pattern, right? It's related to parallel to the touching of the eyes, and I found other accounts. One from an interview of Joseph Smith Sr. That talks about a narrative that I argue in my book is from the last 116 pages, and so on. And I was finding these various things, and they're all sort of like connecting in my mind. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, like, well, when I look at the story of the brother of Jared in Ether 3, he's up on a mountaintop. When Joseph Smith says in Nauvoo, when God's people are poor, they can receive the signs and tokens of the endowment on a mountaintop, but when they're wealthy, they have to build temples. Well, the brother of Jared's people, they're on an exodus like Moses, right? They can't build a temple at that point. And so he's on a mountaintop, so it's like a temple scene, right? And he's speaking with the Lord through the veil, it says. And the Lord puts forth his hand through the veil and asks the brother of Jared a series of questions to test his faith and knowledge, beginning with a question about his hand. And when the man answers the questions correctly, he admits him into his presence and said, "You're redeemed from the fall," evoking the whole backstory of Adam and Eve, right?
Hmm.
And the man is given these white stones, which evokes D&C 130 and Revelation 2:17. Joseph Smith talks about everyone who goes in the celestial kingdom will receive a white stone, and he quotes Revelation 2:17, "To him that overcometh, I will give unto him a white stone in the which is written a new name, which no man knoweth save him that receiveth it." Right? And who is this all happening to? A man described in the narrative only as the brother of Jared. Like his name is being withheld, right? Like
Right.
heightened theme of a withheld name. Then the man is given a revelation that is so comprehensive and so transcendent that he can't share it with others. So he's told to write it and seal it up. That's the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. Then there's like, I didn't see this till later, but accounts from that I talked about in my Lost Pages book of from Lucy Mack Smith and Joseph Smith Sr. together suggest that the interpreters, well, they say the interpreters were triangular and suggest that they were in like compass and square shapes, right? That Joseph Smith Sr. is talking about quote unquote Masonic emblems, namely compass and square, appearing on the top plate and the interpreters being set on this plate. And I'm going through this really fast, so maybe it doesn't make
That's
sense
okay.
to you. But like, but it's in my book, the last 116 pages reconstructing the Book of Mormon's missing stories. Okay. So
It's
the
all in
brother of
there.
Jared is talking with the Lord through the veil, and he receives these compass and square shaped interpreters, right? Like it's everything about this screams temple endowment, right? Well, Joseph Smith is dictating this in 1829. He becomes a Freemason in 1842, 13 years later. I had thought Joseph Smith didn't know anything about the Nauvoo endowment until he becomes a Mason in 1842. What is the structure of much of the endowment doing in the Book of Mormon in 1829? Why is it there? And the more I examined the first vision accounts and the associated account of Joseph Smith's recovery of his first seer stone, his white stone, the more I saw, well, there are all sorts of endowment parallels there, right? This was like Joseph Smith goes to a sort of initiation as a seer. It's a kind of endowment. Well, that takes us all the way back to the beginning of the 1820s. What is that doing there when he's a teenager? Not like when he's in his 30s and he's becoming a Freemason. And I started seeing that there is just tremendous power to this. And it intellectually, it raised questions to me about why would Joseph Smith be coming up with like the model for or structure for a, a ritual that he's not going to institute for more than 20 years later? I mean, it's not like teenagers don't have that kind of time horizon. It's not like, I got the structure for a ritual that over 20 years from now, I'm finally going to institute. Why didn't he just institute it at the beginning? If that, of the church, if that was his intention, it's like the seeds were there for something that doesn't come to fruition for many years. And there
And
was
what I find
tremendous
really interesting, like
power.
you pointing out all the connections between the brother of Jared story and the temple endowment, is that like it's not super obvious. Like I think most members, as they read about that, wouldn't make that connection. I think you're probably one of the first that I've listened to who have pointed that out. So if it's like if Joseph Smith made up the endowment, then he didn't put it in very clear. It's almost very subtly in there, but you can see
Um,
so many elements that then 13 years later, that now he's creating the endowment, but we can see a lot of those elements in the Book of
right,
Mormon,
right,
because the critical narrative is that Joseph Smith doesn't produce the endowment. The idea for it, all the influence comes predominantly from Masonry, and that
right.
you're seeing early influences as well that were early seeds, which Joseph probably might not have even been aware of at the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And like kind of associated with all this, well, okay, and there's a common thing when people talk about feeling uncomfortable when they went through the endowment. Sometimes people talk about this and they'll say something like, I never encountered anything like this before I went through the temple. Well, they did in the Book of Mormon. They just didn't know it, right? Like these things are there, you know. Um, Another kind of associated thing that I started to see is that Joseph Smith doesn't necessarily give the full narrative of the first vision. So when we talk about like the different accounts of the first vision, they tend to give different details. A lot of people are disturbed by something like this. Um, those people, in my opinion, like they're not often not very familiar with historical sources and the way that historical sources work, and that is in different contexts, someone will give different details of the narrative. So this is like the umpteenth podcast episode I've done on my spiritual journey. It's the same journey, right? There's one journey that I've had. I talk about different details in different contexts, right?
Right.
Like, so did Joseph Smith. That's what people do. If people just came up with like a fake narrative, you might expect them to just stick with that basic narrative every time they tell it. But in real life, real experiences have all sorts of complexities and details that you might relate in one context, but not in another, right? Joseph Smith, when he comes out of the grove, he says he goes home and he tells his mother asks him what's wrong. He's really exhausted. And he says, it is all right, mother. I'm well enough off. I've learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. Full stop. You just saw God. Now, all you have to say is, Mom, your church is wrong, right? Well, that's what was relevant to her at the time. He may not have known how much he should talk about the details of a sacred experience right away, right?
Yeah,
So,
because we often assume if Joseph had his first vision in 1820, seeing the Father and the Son, of course he would have went and told his family straight away. But when it came to his encounters with the angel Moroni, Joseph didn't tell his family straight away. It wasn't until the angel Moroni commanded him to go and speak to his father did Joseph do it, which would seem to indicate that he probably didn't. If that was the interaction he had with his mother, it seems that that might be all he related. And from what they have recorded in their history, they talk a lot about the angel visiting Joseph Smith, but they
yeah.
don't talk about the first vision. So it seems from the history, you probably would agree with this, that Joseph likely didn't tell his family about his first vision.
I don't think he necessarily would have told them right away or without some further indication that he should tell them, right?
Right.
And even okay, look at how he describes the first vision being introduced with the voice. This is my beloved son, hear him. That's from a biblical narrative. There's a parallel experience in the Bible. It's the Mount of Transfiguration. The Father testifies of the Son to Peter, James, and John. As soon as the experience is done, Jesus tells Peter, James, and John, see thou tell no man the vision. There's an idea in that narrative, shh, you got to keep this quiet until the right time, right? So why would it be strange for Joseph Smith to think the same thing after his vision, especially when it even has elements from the Mount of Transfiguration experience? There are other elements from that
Okay,
experience.
devil's advocate, we push back here because I know someone's going to say, but wait, Joseph said he went and told a Methodist minister about it in his 1838 account, and he sort of rebukes him, saying there's no such things as visions and revelation in these days. And in his 1832 account, Joseph says you could find none that would believe the heavenly vision. He doesn't elaborate how many he told, but somebody might say, oh, well, he at least told at least the Methodist minister, if not maybe others. What do you think about that?
Sure. So what I'm saying is not that he didn't tell anybody, right? What I'm saying is there may be elements of the experience itself that when he compared them to the Bible, he may have thought that he should be selective about who he tells. And
Mm.
so his account of going home and not telling his mother, just telling her this little bit that he learned from it, would fit with that. As you mentioned, his account of the 1823 Moroni visits fits with it, where he doesn't tell his family until the angel tells him, tell your father, right? There are some of the greatest complexities surrounding the first vision narrative actually probably are on the point that you just brought up, and that is the persecutions. And it's possible that Joseph, it's possible that there's some conflation in Joseph's mind of different time periods, because we do know time periods when he is persecuted by the Methodists in particular for his claims, that are later in the 1820s.
Mm.
And so there's stuff there to be sorted out on
I
a
know as well,
historical
whenever I
level.
interview Stephen Harper, he thinks that Joseph is also reliving, or as he's giving his account of the first vision, because the year 1838 with the Kirtland Bank and then all the persecution in Missouri and going to Liberty Jail, that there's a lot of interpretive memory. And because of the immense persecution that's happening in his present, he's really emphasizing that part of his narrative as he's relating his first vision, almost like, man, this persecution seemed to begin from it all the way back from whenever
Right.
I first told the story of the first vision and that Methodist minister, and it seems like that's something that's very much emphasized in his recording of his past vision because of his present circumstances as well. And I think Michael Quinn also thinks that there might be some conflation between maybe some of the revivals with maybe a later revival as well, or certain things in Joseph's account could be conflated with things later, which I guess that's the messy things about historical accounts as well.
Yeah, I think Steve Harper is probably right. The 1838 history is written in the context of a lot of dissent in the church, the Kirtland persecutions that had just made Joseph flee to Missouri. The 1838 history, the first indication that Joseph is writing it is on the day that charges are brought against Oliver Cowdery by the High Council that result in his excommunication. Some of the Whitmers have just been excommunicated. And the 1832 history starts with phrasing something like, owing to the many false reports that have been made about the rise of the church, I'm offering, this account. And so it's very much in the context of a sense of persecution,
And
and
being
so on.
defensive.
Yeah, right, totally. So if Joseph Smith comes out of the grove and all he tells his own mother at the time is, well, I've learned that the Presbyterians aren't right. We look at that and we're like, but he told us the whole story. We know the whole story, right? But you look at the different accounts and you see that actually in different contexts, he gives different details of the original event. And the details do overwhelmingly fit together coherently. And I think if people look at it and they're like, oh, there are different details here, they're missing the fact that like actually almost all of them fit together comfortably. The idea that in the 1832 account, the mention of just the Lord, and then in the subsequent accounts mentioning seeing the Father and the Son, that's one that needs to be sussed out more. And then the idea that he was promptly persecuted for it is another complexity. The other details all actually fit together really beautifully, but even those. So Walker Wright and I wrote a paper for BYU Studies that gives very early evidence from the same time period as the 1832 account that in fact the father was part of Joseph Smith's first vision experience, that he was relating to others. And so but if we take this idea that Joseph gave information about the first vision selectively, that there's something esoteric here, like with the vision that Peter, James, and John have on the Mount of Transfiguration, then it presents us with the possibility that maybe even if we look at all the available accounts, we still don't have a full picture of what Joseph Smith experienced, that his experience could be bigger, and that, in fact, some of the details that he gives but doesn't elaborate on might point us to some of that fuller picture of the first vision. So let me give a couple examples. Okay. So in one of his accounts of the first vision, Joseph says, my mind was, he's talking about during the vision, my mind was taken away from the objects which surrounded me. Okay. So we think of first vision, we think Joseph's in the grove, in the midst of the trees, presence of God comes down, and it's just the setting for the whole experience is just there in the grove. Okay. Whereas Joseph's saying it's like all the things around him disappear, right? First, he sees the glory of God coming to the trees, and they're not consumed like the burning bush on Mount Sinai for Moses, right? But then it's like the physical setting eventually vanishes for him. So is he still in the grove? Is the setting of the experience, or at least experientially, is it in the grove? Well, he doesn't see the grove at that point. Right? His mind is carried away from the objects which surrounded him. In his 1838 account, he says that at the end of the experience, he says, I found myself lying on my back, gazing into heaven. Well, this sounds like he's like, poof, whoa, like coming back to an awareness of his surroundings suddenly when he hadn't had that awareness for a while. In a sermon that he gives in Nauvoo in 1843, Joseph starts talking about his first vision. And then in the same sermon, he says, any man who has gazed into heaven for 5 minutes knows that there are three grand personages who hold the keys of power there, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Okay. Now, he's talking as if this is an experience he has had. Oh, anybody who's seen into heaven knows this. Okay. When did he have this experience? Well, he's just been talking about the first vision. I'm going to suggest he's talking about the first vision still. That during the first vision, he sees into heaven. Okay, this would fit with his mind being taken away from the objects with which he's surrounded. At the end of the experience, finding himself like back, experiencing his surroundings again, physical surroundings. At the beginning of the Book of Mormon, Lehi has his own first vision where he's called as a prophet. It involves a pillar of fire coming down, the presence of God coming down in a pillar of fire coming down to earth. Joseph describes that same thing. Two of the first vision accounts he uses later, we're more familiar with pillar of light, but in two of the earlier accounts, he says a pillar of fire came down. This is the presence of God coming from heaven down to earth. God is coming down to Joseph's level. God is coming down to Lehi's level in Lehi's first vision. Okay. Then Lehi has a heavenly ascent. Okay. He sees into heaven. Afterward, he sees God sitting on his throne, surrounded by numberless concourses of angels. Okay. In one of Joseph Smith's account, he describes, I saw many angels. Okay.
It's so frustrating that it's just a little side note in one of the accounts. He's like, yeah, I saw one personage appear first, then followed by another. Oh, and by the way, I saw many angels in this vision as well. It's like, right. Joseph, why don't you talk about that more?
Yeah, right. I'm going to suggest the structure of Joseph's experience, these clues are pointing to, is the same structure. The structure of Joseph's first vision is the same structure as Lehi's first vision. The presence of God comes down in the pillar of fire, and then, so the presence of God comes down to the man from heaven. Then God lifts the man up to heaven, to God's level. Okay, so God comes down to the human's level to lift the human up to God's level. Okay, what would that be like? That would be like the entire plan of redemption, right? So the Book of Mormon title page says Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. John, the beginning of the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh, right? God, Jesus is divine. Here he comes down to our level to lift us up to his level, right? The Lehi's first vision and Joseph Smith's first vision both experientially encapsulate the entire gospel plan, the plan of redemption, right? And so God is coming down to our level, right? He becomes incarnate for us to lift us up so we can become like God. You know, this is the idea of exaltation, deification, right? And so I had thought this idea was like not, and there are other things pointing to this that I'm going to be publishing on, okay? But like,
Hmm.
um, I had thought that the idea of exaltation or deification, becoming like God, I thought this was Nauvoo doctrine. Just like I
Right.
had thought endowment was like Nauvoo stuff, not like 1820s like first vision stuff. I was wrong. Okay. I was wrong. What we're thinking of often as Nauvoo ritual and Nauvoo doctrine, not in all cases, but in some cases, it's there from literally day one. First vision, sacred grove. Right. And so as I saw this, as I started to see all this, as this started to click together for me, it was mind blowing. It was so powerful for me. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I couldn't have been more thunderstruck. In that, there in the library cafe at Utah State, as this had just all come together in like a flood of ideas, connect different, one connection after another, but rapidly.
Sort of like these
I had the
intellectual
first,
epiphanies.
yeah, I had the first thought, I think I'm going back to the church. Now, I wasn't ready for that yet. I still need, there was a lot I needed to sort
Like,
out.
okay, hold your horses, Don. You're
But
getting carried away.
that was the first thought. That was the first time the thought struck, and it was all amazing to me.
That's super cool. Well, we're gonna save diving into some of these church history topics more for a part two because there's so many things I want to dive into with the first vision. But then we'll be going here all night. One comment you made though about deification and becoming gods and exaltation being a Nauvoo doctrine. I always thought the same about that, and even not getting into your first vision research, but Doctrine and Covenant 76 talks
Mhm.
about those who
Yeah.
enter the celestial kingdom becoming gods as well. So it's there at 1832. So you can see some early seeds and some revelations, but it seems like they're not fully flushed out theologically until many years later. So I want to get back to your story. So you're having sort of like these intellectual and maybe spiritual
Yeah.
epiphanies, shall we say? You're diving into some things and you're beginning to think maybe this isn't all just made up. At what
Right.
point do you get to the point where you start to believe again in, shall we say, the foundational truth claims, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and then when do you make the decision to I'm going to come back to the church and get rebaptized?
Yeah. So it happened pretty fast, especially considering that I'd been thinking about all these things for several years, right? I had been thinking, could I possibly ever go back to the church? Could I make it fit? Could I make it work for me? And like I said, I would try it out in my head and it would be clearly like, no, I can't. And so I would just think, why did I even bother raising that question? It's a silly question. And I just wouldn't think about it for months. And then something would trigger it again. I'd be like, well, but what if this or that? And so, but once this insight came, th this flood of insight, um, I started really thinking more deeply. And I thought, could I go back to the church? Like, part of the reason I left the church is I felt like I had nothing to offer. I felt like my work was just like a net negative for the church. But I thought, this is not a negative. This is really positive. This would be a big contribution. But can this work for me? Am I too idiosyncratic in my views to be part of the church? Would I still be bugged by going to church?
Were you still
Like
worried about
Latter-day
some of
Saint
the other
culture?
issues or big question marks you had as well? How do I make sense or reconcile some of those things as well?
Well, and I thought, what about all this stuff that I was seeing that had made me think Joseph Smith was an opportunist? Like that didn't suddenly like vanish because I had these insights about the first vision.
Sure.
And so I started, this became really the focus of my thinking for a couple months was like what's going on here? And like it started opening me up to new possibilities again. And things that I'd been hung up on for years, where I felt like I'd been sort of stagnant in my view of Joseph Smith or the Restoration or certain spiritual things, it all started to click and like come together. And part of it was I started asking a new set of questions. I had encountered this principle that I mentioned earlier, that this idea that like a question always focuses our attention somewhere. So you better watch what the questions are that you're asking, especially the ones that you're asking habitually, right? So if I'm, for instance, if I'm asking myself, what's going wrong in my life, and I'm asking that a lot, I'm going to be depressed. I'm going to be stressed and depressed. If I'm asking myself questions that get me focused on gratitude, right? Like what are the gifts that I've been given in my life? Like, for instance, life itself in the first place, right? And therefore everything, every other good thing that I experience, right? It's a
Hmm.
gift, right? And so whatever I ask about routinely, it shapes my experience. And life is made up of a bunch of experiences. And so our questions shape our lives. Well, they also shape our work. They shape our worldview. So my routine question had been about Joseph Smith, about everything he did. What was in it for him? I started to realize that's a very narrow question, especially if it's like the only one, if it's like the guiding question, right? Like if I started asking that about you, if I started
Very,
looking
very
at everything you do
uncharitable.
and saying like, what's in it for Stephen, right? Then I'm going to end up thinking, oh, this guy, he's like really self-serving and narcissistic because everything he does is for him. Well, sure, it looks that way if that's the guiding question that I'm asking about you, right? But what if I start asking other questions? What if I start asking, well, what things is he doing that help other people? Or do I see signs of motives other than self, right? Do I see signs of like, and as soon as I started asking the question, it became really clear with Joseph Smith, his family.
Yeah, so you started to almost
Joseph
see signs of
constantly doing
sincerity.
things for his family.
Hmm.
What?
I said you started to see signs of maybe Joseph's religious sincerity.
Right, right. Well, first I started seeing signs of his sort of personal sincerity with other people, and then his religious sincerity, right? So I looked
Right.
at things about his childhood surgery and how he handled that as a young child. I looked at things he did later in his life to be of service to his father in particular, but also other members of his family. We have Joseph's journals from different periods. There's an entry in his journal, something like, spent the day sliding on the ice with my son Frederick, right? Like he's the busiest guy in Nauvoo, and he takes an entire day to just hang out with his son sliding on the ice of the Mississippi River, right? Um, when Emma is sick at one point in Nauvoo, Willard Richards is keeping Joseph's journal, and he writes that Joseph, day after day, he's writing how Joseph is at Emma's bedside to take care of her. And he writes how concerned Joseph seems about Emma's health. This is a guy who's all about himself. Why is he doting day after day? Why is he so concerned for his wife, right? Once I started asking the question, once I took off the focus of the question of just, oh, what was in it for him, and I'm like, okay, do I see evidence that he is like trying to help other people? Well, I started seeing all kinds of evidence that he's devoted to his family of origin, his family that he creates, right? He's deeply devoted to them and their welfare. And then I started thinking, okay, what about other people more widely? What about, religious signs of religious motives to do things for God? And eventually I started seeing, and this is like, this requires so much like chronological mapping out and complexity that I need to like, rather than try to do it in a podcast, I need to like
You
write
do an article on this.
oh, right, right. But I see all kinds of signs clearly. Joseph Smith was a giant believer in divine providence, that he would look at the flow, the unfolding of events in his life, and he would see the hand of God in his life, and he would make decisions based on those unfolding events. He would make an interpretation of the events. God is trying to tell me something through this repetition of this theme 3 times in a row in these events in my life. And you can watch the events play out, and then you can watch the direction that he takes because of those events. Well, a con man doesn't care what God or the universe is trying to tell him to do. He just cares about himself. That's not this guy. That's not what he's doing. I see signs of it all over. Okay? That he's trying to do what he has different modes of revelation, right? Visions, right? Pure intelligence flowing into him, as he described, right? But also looking for signs of providence in his life, right? Like, so this is like D&C 58 or 59, where it talks about like acknowledging God's hand in all things. Joseph Smith did that. He sees events being tailored by God, and he's trying to figure out, what is God telling me through the events? Again, this is not the sign of a con man at all. This is the opposite. This is a sign of he wouldn't be doing this if he didn't really believe some higher power is communicating to him through the events of his life. So absolutely, Joseph Smith's religiously sincere. Absolutely. I see that as a historian now, right? I didn't see it at the time. I was seeing patterns, but I was seeing them in such a limited frame, and I wasn't seeing these bigger patterns that demonstrate his religious sincerity. I do now, right? And so I didn't see all of that as I was just coming back to the church, but I started to see it, right? And so from the time that I had this kind of epiphany about the first vision to the time that I was rebaptized was actually just under 2 months, okay?
Oh.
I was terrified to reach out to the church. I felt completely blind about what the process would be like when I wanted to leave the church. There were all sorts of websites to tell me exactly how to do it. When I wanted to come back, there was nothing, absolutely nothing to tell me about the process, nothing. So all I knew is I had to meet with a church leader. I went to the bishop where I was then living, who didn't know me from Adam. He showed up. I told him the gist, that I left the church, so I wanted to come back. He said to me, and he wasn't much older than me, but he called me son. And he said, son, the Lord wants you back in his church. And I found out later that so the church offices in Salt Lake City had a copy of my letter that I had written to leave the church, remember, which was designed to make it so I could never come back. And this letter was sent to my stake president and bishop, and my bishop told me that I was going to have to like account for the things that were in my letter. And I cried. I bawled. I thought, they're never going to let me back in the church. They're going to, and they're going to look at what's in this letter, and they're going to not want me back. And I called up the bishop in tears, and he said, son, if the church couldn't forgive, it couldn't be the Lord's church. And he had me take the discussions, which was surreal, because I'd been on a mission. I'd been on the giving end of the discussions, but not the receiving end.
What was that like, receiving the discussions again from the missionaries, being someone who is a real expert in church history, but hearing again sort of like
it was fascinating in terms of perspective. I was initially I didn't want to do it, and then I was like, oh, this will be fun. This will be like a ethnographic experience where I get to see what it's like to be a missionary and an investigator. Right? So the bishop didn't want the missionaries to know that I had previously been a member, because they thought if they know that, they'll skip things from the discussions. They won't explain things in detail.
Right.
So he said, don't tell them. And he wanted a member of the bishopric to be present at each of the discussions. So the place that I was living at the time, just before the missionaries arrived, I realized there was a problem. The bookcases that I had in the hallway that they would be walking through, which had on them every conceivable book on Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, right? I feel like if people looked at the bookcase,
That'd
the
be a bit
books
of
on
a giveaway.
behind you, and they're like, hmm, maybe you have some connection already with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And so I was like, oh my gosh, I have to move that now. So in like a frenzy, I like moved all those books and the bookcases into my room. And so the missionary and the bishop's counselor, or whatever, show up at the door, and I'm like sweaty, right? Like, because I'm out of breath because I just barely moved all this, right? And they come in and they ask me, they start telling me about Joseph Smith, and they say, living here in Utah, it seems like most people already know something about Joseph Smith. What have you learned? What have you encountered so far? And I'm like, well, I've heard some things, but I want to know what you have to say. And asked me like a similar question, I think, about the Book of Mormon. And I just kept trying to kick it back to them. Um, and
Because you could have had a lot to tell them about what you've been learning and discovering.
I talked for days, right? Um, so it was wild. And right before the missionaries had shown up, before I'd moved the bookcases, I'd been in a discussion group online about like church related stuff. And it was actually a discussion group dominated by ex-Mormons. And, a lot of discussion about these topics is kind of low level and kind of ugly, a lot of contention and so on. And after the
Absolutely.
meetings left, I was just sitting there thinking about what they'd said. And I thought, what was I doing before all this? And I thought, oh, I was on the message board. And I thought, oh, I'll go back to the message board. I opened up my computer. I was like, no, this feels like I'm going from an elevated place down to a lower place. I don't want to do this. Right. And I suddenly realized that after that discussion, I felt really elevated. I felt like at a spiritual high point. And I was like, wow, I didn't even notice that during the discussion, right? I have studied church things, gospel things from the time I was a kid. And during those discussions, I had new insights about the gospel. I thought it was just going to be really basic and kind of like fun, but I learned things. And I saw also as a chance to kind of like renew my commitments to live the gospel. And so I took advantage of that. At the last discussion, a bishop was there, and he told the missionaries, he finally opened up to them. He said, Don was a member of the church before, but he left. He had his name removed from the records of the church, and he wants to be rebaptized. I don't know what he was thinking, but one of the missionaries, tears started to roll down his face, and it seemed like he was really, I don't know, it really struck him. I think maybe realizing that I had been part of the church but had left, and that they were helping me come back. Bishop had me write a letter formally requesting readmission to the church, where I needed to address the things I'd said in my exit letter that was designed to keep me back, keep me from coming back. My second letter really, my letter requesting to come back was very powerful. It really dealt with the issues in the first letter. And the bishop had me meet with him and one of his counselors at his office and read them the letter out loud. And as soon as I was done reading it, he said, on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'd like to invite you to be baptized. And he asked me when I would want to be baptized, and it was like a Thursday or something, and I was like, "Can we do it this Sunday?" And so that Sunday after church, I was rebaptized,
Wow.
and I it felt amazing, and I went on to one of the online message boards. This one more with more Latter-day Saints on it. I went on both of the major ones that I participated in and announced my rebaptism, and I got very different reactions from the two groups. But on the one that was dominated by Latter-day Saints, 200 people commented to welcome me back to the church. 200 people. I think I had thought that somehow I was going to be kind of like a pariah for having left. And nothing could have been further from the truth. And a year later, and I actually got permission, by the way, from a general authority to talk about this, because at the time I couldn't find any accounts where anybody talked about it publicly. So I wanted to make sure that I was okay to talk about it. So I wrote to Elder Marlon K. Jensen, who was then the church historian in a 70. If you have been endowed and you leave the church and you come back, you need what's called a restoration of blessings. And I'd heard of this for years, but I literally had no idea what it was.
Mm.
Do you go through the endowment again? Do they do it in the temple? Is it at church? Is it somewhere else? Is it a laying on of hands? What is it? I didn't even know what it was. Basically, you put in a petition if you've been back in the church for a year, and you describe your leaving and your return and so on. They have different questions. And I went through that process. And so a little over a year after my rebaptism, I met with the stake president at his office for my restoration of blessings. And he showed me a letter. And the letter, interestingly, oddly, is a letter from the first presidency to me, but I couldn't keep the letter. I just had to read it at the stake president's office, and then he had to send it back.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. And the letter quoted the Doctrine and Covenants saying, "To him that repenteth, Lord, will remember his sins no more." And he laid his hands on my head, the stake president did, and um, he pronounced that all the blessings that I'd received, he reordained me an elder, and he pronounced that the blessings I'd received of the temple and so on were restored to me. And afterward, so when if you've left the church or you've been excommunicated or whatever, you have been endowed before that and you come back to the church, there's something funny that shows up on your local ward church record. It shows your original endowment date, but it says your endowment is not active now, right? Because it's been effectively canceled by you leaving the church, right? Until a restoration of blessings happens. But it has your new baptism date on it. So anybody looking at that record could see that you must have left the church and come back, right? And who's going to see that? Only the ward clerk or something, right? But nonetheless, they could tell. If you have a restoration of blessings, they put your
baptism is behind you.
Oh, my wife was just reminding me that this is actually my baptismal certificate.
Oh, wow.
Right here for my rebaptism. I should actually find the one from when I was 8 and my dad baptized me and put that up here too. This is the bishop who baptized me, beautiful man. my friend Lincoln Cannon, the bishop who oversaw my rebaptism, and my friend Lincoln Cannon rebaptized me. So I,
Man.
huh?
I just said, man, like that's so like beautiful and powerful. I feel really inspired and touched by this story. Keep going. Keep sharing.
So the local record, if you've had a restoration of blessings, your original baptism date is put back on the record. So if that happens, let's say if you get a restoration of blessings, you move to a new ward, no one would ever know unless you told them. No one in your new ward would ever know you'd ever been out of the church, right? It's erased.
It's like it is remembered no more.
It's remembered no more, right? So I know people have all sorts of wrestles with the church. They have different kinds of experiences. I experienced from the church just like a complete forgiveness, right? Like a remembering no more, right? And that welcoming back with open arms has just been a beautiful thing to me. I really had this idea for some reason that there would be something punitive in the process of my coming back, that they put me through a sort of penance, right? Because I had left. I thought that people in the church would be suspicious of me because, oh, that's that guy who left for a while. He was an apostate, you know.
There's that
And
traitor who left and now just wants to come back again
right.
for
And
us
I
to
just,
receive him with open arms.
right. And so instead, it was like Joseph Smith with W.W. Phelps, right? So W.W. Phelps in Missouri, he leaves the church and he actually says some things publicly that put the church in like Joseph Smith and others in legal jeopardy in Missouri. And he realizes within a couple years, oh, I've made a massive mistake. And he writes to Joseph Smith saying something like, basically like, you probably won't want me back, but I've realized that I was wrong and I want to be back. And Joseph writes him back and says something about like the returning prodigal, right? And says, come, join back with us, basically we'll receive you with open arms. And says, he quotes a line of a poem saying something about friends at first shall be friends at last.
Yeah.
That example of forgiveness from Joseph Smith is also what I've experienced, right? And so when the bishop had said to me, if the church couldn't forgive, it couldn't be the Lord's church, right? Like, well, the church absolutely has forgiven me. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about my own leaving and return. I think when you sent me some questions in advance of this show, kind of like, did I think this was like a necessary part of my journey, or that like this was kind of a mistake, or I could have done things differently? I kind of think both, because I think that I could have. There are things I could have done differently that I didn't see at the time. I didn't know to do them at the time, but in retrospect, I see, right? I also think that it's clear to me God has used this, right? And that there are things that, while there might be other ways to learn them, I wasn't going to learn them another way. I personally, right? And those are personal spiritual things, but there's also things about the history of the church. For me personally, being outside the church as a historian meant I could consider any possibility. I did not feel like I had to make anybody else happy with my theories or explanations or models. I didn't feel like I needed to bound my views in some certain way to make them faithful or acceptable to anyone. So I just ran with whatever. And even though at the time I was out of the church, a number of those discoveries, the frame that I was putting them on them in the big picture was this very negative frame. There are possibilities I wouldn't have considered, interpretations I wouldn't have considered if I hadn't felt like I could come up with any interpretation, right? That now I've brought back in with me, right? And so I see for my own self, I was talking earlier about Joseph Smith being a believer in providence, maybe not in all the same ways or to the same degree of detail that it seems to me he saw it, but I'm a believer in divine providence. I see providence in my life. And I am grateful, right, for all of this. I'm grateful for the restoration. I'm grateful for the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm grateful that even though I gave up on God, God never gave up on me, right? And I did. I totally gave up on God, and God never gave up on me, right? God kept working with this guy, right? Brought me back into a relationship with God, and I am grateful for the church. And I'm grateful for the beautiful, powerful, positive things that it brings. And something I guess I forgot to mention from my journey, my coming back spiritually, is it wasn't just the intellectual evidences. That also triggered a reassessment of my spiritual experiences. So kind of like when I came to believe that there was a mind behind the universe, I started looking again at that experience that had saved my life, right? On
Because
State
you said
Street.
earlier that you didn't deny your spiritual experiences, you just reinterpreted what they meant. You didn't see them as reliable. Maybe they were just experiences within your mind, not actually God speaking to you. Whereas it seems now that you're more open again to God and the divine, that you're maybe open to reinterpreting that maybe they were real spiritual experiences I had whenever I was in the church.
Yeah, well, something that I started raising, a thought that I started to have is in every domain of truth, there are particular methods for getting at truth. So if I am a historian or if I am a mathematician, I don't generally use the same methods for getting at truth, right? So
Right.
mathematicians have equations, they have deductive proofs, and so on. Not so much in history, right? Like there might be occasions or particular techniques in history, quantitative history, where those can be applicable, but generally that's not what you're doing, right? If I'm a chemist, right, I am doing certain kinds of analyses of the electrons in certain elements or molecules. I might use a microscope. I will do experiments to look at reactions. Not if I'm a mathematician, right? And not if I'm a historian. Again, right? So every domain of truth has its own toolkit for determining truth. So what's the toolkit when it comes to religion and spirituality? Right? So obviously spiritual experiences are part of that, right? And so is the idea that we find, like Jesus teaches it, right? And we find it elsewhere, of judging things by their fruits, right? And so what I tried to do when I was assessing after these first vision discoveries, if I should in fact come back to the church, what I tried to do is I tried to look beyond just even the individual spiritual experiences, and I tried to look at the totality of my life experience, right? And so the question that I formed is I thought to myself, if I ask myself, what is the testimony of my life's experiences, life's experience regarding the restoration? Is it true? And I just thought, oh, of course. Like the gospel had worked in my life. That really hadn't been the question, right? So when I had been most focused on living the gospel, had it worked in my life? Yeah, right? Very much. And in a whole variety of ways. So my questions had been more like
For validity
philosophical
versus
way.
utility.
Yeah, my questions have been more like philosophical, like about the problem of evil and suffering, or theological, and they've been more historical, like, okay, if I look back and I try to create sort of a genealogy of the ideas of the early restoration, where did they come from? Well, when I was focused on those questions, there were some open questions there. But if I was focused just on the testimony of my own life's experience, why would I reject this? Why would I push this away? This is tremendously, beautifully fruitful in my own life. That's my life's experience.
I love that. Man, your story, it's powerful, it's inspiring. I've heard it so many times before, but I feel like hearing it again and having this discussion, you sharing these so many things, I resonate so much with it in so many ways in light of my story, and it's inspiring and has touched me. I've had so many questions that I would want to ask you, but for the sake of how long this has gone, and I want to end on the nice note that we've been going on, I'm just going to finish with three questions, and then we're going to do hopefully another part where we're going to explore a lot more church history topics, truth claim topics. I feel like I could talk to you all day, done. And unfortunately, I have to work tomorrow, so I can't stay up all night. So I'm going to ask you this question. So I'm going to put on a skeptical hat. And I wonder if you maybe got some of these questions or this pushback after you joined the church. I'm sure there's going to be some four members who will believe that you sincerely had experiences that brought you back, sincerely believe again, and will respect that, you've come to your conclusion. There might be some skeptics who might think that, you just couldn't hack being an atheist and losing your faith, not having purpose and a worldview, and you thought you were having these spiritual epiphanies, and you just really wanted to come back to church because deep down you loved it, you missed it, and you've just sort of set to one side all of the historical issues or all of the evidence you saw against that. You were very much rational and logical when you left the church, but it was more emotional when you came back. What would be your response to somebody who would say that?
Sure, a couple things. So first off, yeah, I did
Without
get
swearing at
this.
them.
What?
Without swearing at them, flip off. No, you jerk.
It obviously makes sense to me that people would have questions. Like I've been an ex-Mormon, so those aren't difficult shoes for me to put myself in. They're my own past shoes, right? So when I first came back to the church, the predominantly ex-Mormon message board that I was talking about, there was a nice guy on there who's actually a geneticist. He was an ex-Mormon, and he just kept posting like post after post about, well, maybe Don Bradley came back because of this, and he'd give a kind of psychological explanation. Then he'd do another post and he'd be like, or maybe it was this. And I just watched honestly with like tremendous fascination, because it seemed like he cycled through just like a number of different explanations. And so finally I commented and I said, it seems like you're really interested in finding a kind of psychological explanation for my return to the church. And he said, yeah, because it just doesn't make sense to me logically. And so I just have to try to come up with an explanation. Well, there's a term for that, and it's cognitive dissonance. And ironically, cognitive dissonance is a term that ex-Mormons use quite a bit, right?
Yes.
But it's easier to recognize cognitive dissonance in others than it is in ourselves, right? So if somebody comes to a conclusion that doesn't make sense to you, and your immediate reaction is, well, maybe, and it's something to kind of explain it away or dismiss it,
Yes.
that's acting on cognitive dissonance right there, right? And so the question is that are those things good explanations? So again, if we're playing like historian here, okay, are those good explanations for this particular person's set of experiences? So transferring taking the historical method kind of away from Joseph Smith and putting it here on me, like my story, right? Okay. So I think that if people look at the work that I'm publishing in the history of the church, okay, the work that I'm publishing about Joseph Smith, and they look for, how much is the evidence being engaged with? How objectively is the evidence being engaged with? How systematically? I think that what they're going to tend to find is that actually I'm doing very good historical work, okay? And that the historical work that I'm doing points in the directions of what I'm saying about Joseph Smith and his religious sincerity and so on, right? Now, obviously, Joseph Smith could be sincere and be sincerely mistaken, right? That's a possibility, right?
Sure.
But like, I would invite people, rather than just having a sort of knee-jerk or reflex reaction that, oh, well, that's not the conclusion that I've come to, so this must be based for him on something other than the evidence. Well, maybe take a look at how I engage with the evidence rather than just making an assumption on that, right? There was something else. Okay. Well, specifically on this idea that when I left the church or I was out of the church, I was thinking logically about Joseph Smith, but now I'm just like setting all that aside, setting aside the things that I found about Joseph Smith while I was outside the church. That would be a real misunderstanding of what I've done. And that is everything that I discovered about Joseph Smith while I was outside the church, I have retained in coming back to the church. That's part of what I was saying about bringing it back with me and talking about my sense of providence in my journey is there are things I wouldn't have arrived at, it seems to me, if I hadn't gone this route of belief where every interpretation was open to me, any possibility. I brought those things back in. Now they're just in a larger frame. Right. So all the things that I saw when I was asking the question, well, what was in it for him? Right. It's not like suddenly, oh, I don't see any of that anymore. Joseph Smith wasn't a human being with normal human motivations or whatever. No. I see the patterns of Joseph Smith's life, but I see them in a much bigger frame, not a smaller frame. So I'm not dismissing things that I found. I'm keeping them and putting them in a much wider, bigger, more complex context where I can explain far more about Joseph Smith through the model that I have of him now, far more than I could with the model that I had then. It's a bigger model. It's a model of a more complex human being. And again, I would invite people, look at what I publish and see if that's not so. I also, like friends that I'm very close to, who have been my interlocutors in my work while I was outside the church and since I've come back. Right? So I mentioned earlier, Maxine Hanks was really well ahead of me in seeing Joseph Smith's sincerity when I thought he was a scoundrel, right? Like she has certainly seen that my work now explains more than it did then. My friend Trevor Luke, whom I mentioned, like he can attest and he's not active in the church. I don't know where he would place himself, but he's not a conventionally believing Latter-day Saint. And so there are others who I think would make these same observations. But I would say, like as I continue to publish, look at my actual work and see, am I bracketing out difficult, do I avoid difficult sources in church history? Actually, I make quite a bit of use of unbelieving sources in the early history of the church and so on. Along with believing sources, I don't reject sources because of their vantage point or whatever. I use them all within a systematic framework.
In a very comprehensive and fair way. And it seems like, from what I'm taking from what you're saying, is that when you had this view of Joseph Smith as insincere or an opportunist or a con man, you feel like there were some pieces of, say, the prophet jigsaw puzzle that might support that view, but you feel now, looking at Joseph, seeing him more as sincerely, religiously sincere, and viewing him as a prophet, you feel like there's more pieces of the puzzle that fit that model better, that there's still some, maybe tricky issues. There's maybe still you can offer some validity to that viewer interpretation, but you don't think it accounts as well for the person of Joseph Smith.
It's very limited in what it can explain. So if we were to try to predict what Joseph Smith would do in a given situation based on one of these models, the opportunist model would actually have very limited predictive power, whereas this more comprehensive model that takes into account his religious sincerity can account for a lot more of what he does. And so an example of that, which, like I said, I will be writing about in the future, is Joseph Smith frequently perceiving signs of divine providence in his life and taking actions based on them. Doesn't fit with the opportunist model, right? It's stuff you can't explain. So a better model, whether in science or in history, is the one that explains more of the data. One of these explains far more than the other. Yeah. And
that's so true.
I thought of something else. Okay. Something just about me. Yes, when I came back to the church, also some people thought of me as an apologist. Now, anytime someone defends a vantage point, I suppose they're acting as an apologist. One can be an apologist for something good or something bad. It's not inherently like a bad thing.
Just means to defend a position.
Yeah, I think it also misunderstands me because I'm motivated tremendously by curiosity, right? So I just want to know what happened, right? If it had turned out that Joseph Smith was a scoundrel, I mean, that's the theory I was running with for years. It's not like I was averse to that idea. I was disappointed by it initially, right? But I got used to it and I was running with it for years. It's not like, had that model continued to be fruitful, I would have stuck with it, And so if it had turned out that the evidence was Joseph Smith was, visited by aliens in the sacred grove or whatever, I would want to know that. If it turned out that the Spalding theory had been true, I would have wanted to know that. I looked into all, maybe not so much the alien theory, but I looked into like all different things, and I just want to know what happened.
Yeah, you're still open to exploring all sources or evidence for or against faith promoting or not. You're still very much curious. Now that leads me to the next question I want to ask you, because I can relate in some ways to your story. Whenever I came back, I felt like it was primarily having very profound spiritual experiences and really resonated with you feeling like welcome back with loving arms, come back to your spiritual home and feeling like on the spiritual high. And what I'm kind of curious about is I feel like in the year since I've been back, I didn't maybe have as many intellectual discoveries as you have per se, and I still felt like I had a huge shelf of issues and not as many maybe resources or years of really diving in deeply as you had.
Sure.
And my year since being back, it's been a bit of a wrestle between these spiritual experiences. I continue to either find some apologetic answers or reconciliation, finding some positive evidence in favor, and then encountering more issues, more challenges, causing me to almost call into question some of those experiences and almost feeling a little bit of a wavering or a wrestle back and forth. Since you've been back in the church, you've been back, what, 10 years? More than 10 years?
It's been more, yeah.
Has there been any periods of, I'm sure there's been questions, but maybe doubts or faith challenges or struggle? Like, how would you describe your year since getting back? Because it's not always going to be, clean sailing and it was happily ever after. How would you describe your faith journey since being back?
That's a good question. It's mostly been beautiful. There have been a couple of crisis points, and they were different from the sort of faith crisis that I described having before I left the church. One of them had to do with grappling more with some of what Joseph Smith's humanness looked like in practical terms. There's a lot of rough stuff surrounding the introduction of plural marriage, and like how do we weigh out what all of that means, and like the complex legacies of that in the restoration today. There was one point where that became something of a personal crisis to me. Like I said, there is a lot to grapple with, and maybe in a future episode we can talk more about, polygamy.
I think that'd be good to cover because you didn't mention this, I think, in your story with me today, but you were the primary researcher for Brian Hales and his 3 volumes, collecting the 1,500 sources and documents on Joseph Smith's polygamy. So you could say that you, with Brian, are probably 2 of the living experts on Joseph Smith's polygamy. So I think it would be great to have a discussion on that because you've done a lot of great research and some current stuff on dating Fanny Alger and talking about Joseph Smith's wives in Nauvoo as well, and the order of them, and some of the early wives being pregnant, and all that's really fascinating.
The order of the wives for his motivations and so on, which, there are some things that come out looking far more positive than people thought about Joseph Smith's motivations and starting Nauvoo polygamy. And I've got
certainly muddies and makes it a lot more complex to the opportunist model. Some of those things that you presented in Nauvoo, it makes you think maybe there's more going on here.
There's more of a theological and spiritual motive and more of a religious sincerity than people coming from the opportunist angle would see or would have thought or given him credit for. There also, so there's a lot of that. And then there's also the stuff about like the fact that like D&C 132 itself talks about, it asks Emma to forgive Joseph for his trespasses when it's talked about in the context of his trespasses against her, in the context of talking about their conflict over the introduction of polygamy, right? And so Joseph's own revelation there doesn't seem to, and it says other things like that in verses 50 and 60. So it's not like Joseph's own revelation on plural marriage seems to say this was rolled out perfectly, no problems here. It seems to say that there were problems, right? And so grappling with what some of those problems were and the impact of those is a real thing. I had a profound spiritual experience since I've been back to the church several years ago, that really made me think much more deeply about God's sort of majesty and transcendence. And that actually, in some ways, really rocked me, like almost shook me. Maybe like when Isaiah says, like, he sees the Lord in the temple and he says, like, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, right? Like, and that, in a strange way, that occasioned its own sort of temporary crisis. But my experience overwhelmingly, though, being back in the church has been beautiful. And I can't see how intellectually, for one thing, having pieced together what I have of the indications of Joseph Smith's personal motivations, I can't see how I could ever arrive again at the view that he was opportunistic as opposed to religiously sincere. And my own, like I said, the testimony of my life's experience in the church from the time I was a child until now, right? Not that I haven't had ever difficulties in the church, obviously, like everybody has different facets of their experience with their life within the community. But just overwhelmingly points to the goodness of this.
I love that. I'm going to ask you last two final questions. So the first question is, what advice would you give to somebody who is going through their own crisis of faith, be it to do with things with the church history, the truth claims of the restoration, or maybe it's Jesus Christ and whether or not there's a God, or someone who's maybe trying to reconstruct after loss of faith? What is your advice to them in light of your story, your experience? What would you say to someone who is in a faith crisis?
Sure. There might be a number of things. A couple would be, one would be this idea that I raised earlier in the context of questions about the focus of our attention. So I know from personal experience, and it sounds like you do, that when you encounter difficult things that raise questions, things that you wrestle with in the church, right? Whether that's in the history or scripture or doctrine or church policy or whatever it is that people are finding distressing, right? Anything that we find distressing, we tend to focus on. Okay. So kind of like if I experience pain in some part of my body, I probably focus on that pain in order to figure out what's causing it or alleviate it or whatever, right? And so if you think about what are the good things, first of all, what is a religion all about? Well, at its root, it's about spiritual things. It's about spirituality. It's about relationship with God or the ultimate, the divine, however the different religions perceive that. It's also about how we live good lives in light of that relationship and how we build good community in light of that relationship with the divine. So if what we're getting focused on about our religion is something other than that because of some kind of distress, then we're not focusing on what the religion is all about in the first place. And so our faith is going to have a harder time filling its natural function of giving us spiritual experience, spiritual grounding, spiritual transformation, direction in our lives, connection with others within our spiritual family. So when I have been at times of greatest like crisis, I tend to focus on the things that I'm in crisis about, and those become my primary experience of my religion, of the restoration, right? Even though they may actually be a very small aspect of that big picture, right? And so allowing ourselves to get perspective. So if this is my issue that I'm having a crisis about, the closer I bring it, right, the more it dominates my field of vision. So maybe I can't see what's over here because I'm just so focused on this. So if I hold it back at arm's length, I keep it in perspective. I see actually this cup is not bigger than the rest of the room, but if I've got it right here and this becomes my focus, then it is bigger, right? Or you can make the same analogy, maybe a better analogy, with like a tree and the moon, right? The moon is vastly larger than a tree, but if you're standing, right by the tree and the moon's behind it, well, it looks like the tree's bigger than the moon, right? So keeping things in perspective. So that means, for one thing, not getting so overwhelmed maybe with the thing that we have a question about or a problem with, that it becomes almost like obsessive, right? Like I'm just focused, my energy when it comes to my life or to my spirituality and religion is just focused on this issue. Well, then it's going to take up all my awareness, all the space there. And the things that actually are nourishing in the gospel, the things that will help me in my life, including to help keep this in perspective, maybe I'll crowd them out, right? So continuing to maintain a real spiritual life, right? So whatever that looks like for you, what are the aspects of the gospel that you do believe in? What are the aspects of the gospel that you do experience as or recognize as good? And how can you keep in touch with those? How can you treasure those, make use of those in your life? What are the spiritual practices, whether it's, are there certain things within the scriptures that still deeply resonate with you that you could read or study? Is it prayer? Is it service? Is it certain types of church activities? Or, you know what I'm saying? So, not letting the another analogy to marriage, like we had earlier, might be good. Okay. So like if a couple is having some issue between them in their marriage, if they become just fixated on that, they both become fixated on just that one problem area, they become disconnected from the reasons that they came together in the first place. They didn't come together because they had this problem, right? They came together for positive reasons, connection that they had, things they have in common. But if they allow the problem to dominate their attention in the relationship, that problem can become the whole relationship, even though it doesn't have to be, right? And so if the couple finds ways of reconnecting with what they share in common, their values, their interests, they have dates or activities centered around that, and so on, they can keep the problem in perspective and work it out in that larger context. It's the same thing with our relationship with our faith and with God, right? If we allow the problem to become a fixation where it crowds out the reasons that we embrace the gospel in the first place, the things that we love about it, the things that are nourishing about it, we're putting ourselves on a path to divorce from, like, failure of and divorce from our faith and from that relationship, just like in a marriage.
It's actually some really great wisdom and quite profound advice, you putting it that way. Right, final question, then I'm going to let you go.
Well, I guess I have one more answer for that. I mean, there would be others too, but one more that I'll bring up, and that is, um, a lot of times, in my experience, when we have faith problems, it's because we have an idea in our minds, a fixed idea of how things should be, right? So what we think is, if the church were true, things would be like this, right? And
Right.
let's say the problem is with a certain policy in the church, right? And let's say I lived in the church in 1977 before, the priesthood ban was lifted by the 1978 revelation. And I'm like, I would just really have a problem being part of a church that excludes, men of African descent from holding the priesthood, or African families from going to the temple. It should not be this way in God's church. So I'm going to leave, right? So, let's say that, I know there's survey research showing people have a wide range of views now on the origin of the priesthood ban, but about a third of the church members think it was of divine origin, about a third think it was human origin, a mistake because of racism, and about a third are undecided. Okay, let's suppose the answer that it was from racism. Okay, then is the idea that, well, if the church were right, then we would never fall into following like problematic aspects of our culture like that. The church leaders would never have done that. So then I would ask, what are we basing that on? Okay. So if we look at the scriptures, okay, and we look at, say, the church in the Book of Mormon, the Nephite church, is there any sign that they were racist toward Lamanites? There's massive sign that they were like,
Yeah.
or if we look at
It's the Book of Mormon.
if we look at the church, the children of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is there a sign that like they really like they followed their surrounding culture in a lot of things, and they needed to learn to outgrow the things in that culture? Right. Well, yeah, that's all over the entire Old Testament. Or, in the New Testament, is there a sign that they were influenced by their surrounding culture, and that originally there's prejudice among the Jewish Christians against Gentiles? Yes, there's sign of that all over the place. So when we set up an expectation of what it should be like among God's people, where are we getting that expectation? Are we getting it empirically? Are we deriving it from looking at, okay, when God has had a people in the past, what have they been like? How perfect have they been? How much have they just transcended all the surrounding culture and just already been at this like high divine standard consistently already? Or how much did they have to grow incrementally? Okay. Where is our expectation on this coming from? Or let's say our idea is, well, church leaders, particularly prophets, like they couldn't make like substantial mistakes, or they're human, but they can't be like that human, like us, right? Like, okay, well, where is the expectation coming from? And is there a way to test the expectation, or to derive our expectations empirically rather than just coming up with them? This is how I think it should be, therefore it has to be that way. Well, again, let's look at the Bible. Okay. So, Noah, like, after the flood, the description is he gets drunk, right? And then when his son Ham does something that embarrasses him, he puts a curse on Ham's son of servitude, of the son and all the son's descendants. How much sense does that make? Does this seem like, wow, this is exactly what I would expect a prophet to do? Or
Thanks, Grandpa.
Abraham's family is like, family life this is not a picture of domestic harmony. This is a mess, right? With what happens with Hagar and other things. Okay. Isaac shows massive favoritism to one of his sons over the other son. Jacob Well, he deceives his father, and he
Steals his brother's birthright.
yeah, right. Uh, Jacob's sons are a complete disaster. Even the one who's like the big hero in the story, Joseph. Well, you read the story and it really looks like he starts out arrogant. His brothers try to kill him. One of the brothers has an affair with his own dad's wife. Like two of the brothers contrive this bloody plot to kill the men of Shechem. And like, they're a complete mess. Now, they're not role models. They're not role models, right? They're people that God chose, but they're not our exemplar, right? You can go through the entire Hebrew Bible, you can go through the New Testament. There is an exemplar there, and it's not any of these people, right? The apostles at first, at least in the New Testament, look like clowns. Peter denies Jesus. Peter the Rock denies Jesus 3 times. I mean, so when we set up a standard of perfection or these really high expectations of what someone chosen by God would or wouldn't do, where are we deriving that from? Are we deriving it from looking at, hey, when God's had prophets in the Bible or chosen people in the Bible, they're often a mess, but God really uses them. They have very human weaknesses, but God uses them and they grow. Or are we setting up this idea of just out of our own imagination? Here's what a prophet should look like. Now I'm comparing certain people in the restoration to that. He doesn't look like that, so he can't be a prophet, right? What if we applied the same standard to the people I was just talking about from the Bible? Wouldn't we just reject the Bible? And so when we think about like, where are we getting our expectations? I mentioned earlier the problem of evil and suffering. I look at the world and I don't think to myself, the way this happens with certain like childhood diseases or the Holocaust or whatever, that's what I would do if I were God. That's not what I think, right? God apparently works very differently than I think I would work if I were God. So do I measure things against my expectations, or do I measure things by looking at what God actually allows or does in the world, right? If I'm setting up expectations that are just stuff I came up with, and then I'm holding God to that standard, I'm putting myself in the place of God. I'm trying to be God and make God something less than God, right? And so I think that just like watching our expectations and considering where do these expectations actually come from, how well do I really know that this is how things would be if this were God doing this, God would do it this way. How well do I really know that? Or how much is that me just playing God in my imagination?
Okay. Right. Final question. I think this would be a good summary question, probably of this whole interview. But how would you describe and summarize your testimony from before your faith crisis and now the foundation of your faith and your testimony now?
Yeah. I mean, I think originally it was something that was a lot more given to me from outside of myself. I was told the way that things were. They were pretty straightforward and simplistic. And the more that I have learned, the more I realized that while there are some things that are simple in life and simple in the gospel, like for instance, if I'm living the basic gospel principles, right, that there's a simplicity there that can help keep me on track in my life. But there's also a great complexity in what I see in the restoration and how God works in the world. And we, as Latter-day Saints, we tend to just love to emphasize the simplicity of things, right? And if we find that things in the realm of religion aren't simple the way that we thought, that's a problem for us. It's like, oh my gosh, no, this isn't supposed to be complex. This is supposed to be simple. Well, we think that the biological study of the biological organisms on Earth is really complex. The study of the origins of the universe is really complex. The study of like the social dynamics of human communities, sociology is really complex. But when it comes to understanding the God who created all of that and makes it all work, it's supposed to be really simple. That's silly, right? Obviously, it shouldn't be simple. Like God is going to be much more complex in many ways than we would think. And so my own understanding of the restoration, my understanding of the gospel, my own testimony in many ways is in some ways simple, and in some ways it's increasingly complex. And I am much less likely to kind of tell God how God should be or what God should do, and more try to look at things and try to understand what God has done and what God is doing. I see profound depths of how God works with human beings, illustrated in the life of Joseph Smith, illustrated in the Restoration, and now like kind of in my own life experience along my own journey, and I recognize more and more that our experience of human frailty, our own and that of others, even the people we like, the people who are heroes to us, the people who are prophets in scripture and in the history of the church, recognizing the frailty and human weakness of those people, along with their tremendous strengths, right? The tremendous aspects of their character, it points us more fully to Christ. It points us more fully to the perfection that God has. It points us more fully to the fact that all of us need Christ's atonement, right? That none of us are exempt from that, that we're all truly human. We are weak. And if we bring our weaknesses to him, we can receive forgiveness and we can grow and have weaknesses turned into strengths.
I love that. Well, Don, this has been amazing having this time and have this interview and discussion. I have waited 2 years for it, but I have to say it was worth the wait. Absolutely love just hearing your story. And all the insights. It's inspiring. I've loved this time to connect with you, and we're hoping to do another episode as well, a part 2 where we're going to dive into more church history topics and truth claim topics, and to really dive into some of these things that Don has just great expertise and so many insights as well. And it's just a really thoughtful person. But I'm really grateful for your time that you've given to have this interview with me. I'm very grateful to your wife who helped coordinate things as well. Yeah. And hopefully it won't be another 2 years till we do part 2. Hopefully it'll be much sooner. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Yes, props to Jasmine, my wife, for lining this up and helping me get set up with the microphone and everything. And yeah, it's been delightful.
It's quite a funky mic. It's been great. Yeah. And listeners who will be watching this, if you've enjoyed it, give this a like, comment underneath as well, and share this video with others as well if you think it's an inspiring interview for other people to hear. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you care to donate, you can via PayPal or Patreon. I'll link in the description other interviews and episodes Don has been on, and don't forget to come back to part 2. See you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph.
Take care. Bye-bye.